Hello and welcome to the End Times Revival Ministries today. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we continue with our series on familiarity with God. I want us to look at a passage in the book of Hebrews chapter 12 from verse 18 all the way to verse 29, but I will select a couple of scriptures. The context is this, that you have the author of the book of Hebrews juxtaposing between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And in verse 18, talking of how people would approach God in the Old Covenant, says the following: "You've not come to the mountain that may be touched and that burned with fire, and to blackness and darkness and tempest, the sound of trumpet and the voice of words, so that those who heard it begged that the word should not be spoken to them anymore." What he is narrating here is the experience of every person who would approach God in the Old Testament with gifts and sacrifices. There was a terror, a fear of the presence of God. There was blackness, as the scripture tells us, and darkness and tempest and trumpets and the voice of words that shook the mountain, that the people did not want to approach the mountain anymore. Then he goes on in verse 22 to talk about what we've come to. We've also come to a mountain, he says, but you've come to Mount Zion. This is not Mount Sinai, which he spoke about in verse 18, but Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus the mediator of the new covenant, to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. And so he talks about the witnesses and the presence we've come to in the New Testament. It's not just God, he says, but there's a whole range of witnesses that we've come to. And the interesting factor here, what he talks about, we can easily and comfortably accept that and perhaps interpret that to mean that we don't need to fear God anymore because there is a new covenant and we live in a time of grace. But if you go on and look at what the author of Hebrews talks about from verse 25 all the way to 27, he talks about the fact that in the Old Covenant in Mount Sinai, when God spoke, the earth shook. It doesn't talk about the heavens shaking, the earth shook. But in the New Covenant, he says, "See that you do not refuse him who speaks. For if they did not escape who refused him who spoke on earth, much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him who speaks from heaven, whose voice then shook the earth. But now he has promised, saying, Yet once more I shake not only the earth, but also the heaven." In other words, there is a much more demonstration, there is a greater demonstration of God's power and authority over his creation in the new covenant. And that is yet to come, of course, but it will come. As you read the book of Revelation, you clearly pick the shaking of the heavens and the earth. And so the author warns us that in the presence that we had come to under the old covenant, we were fearful because his voice and his demonstration of power shook the earth. But under the new covenant, he will shake not just the earth, but also the heavens. And he wraps up that particular passage in verse 28 and 29 as follows: "Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us have grace by which we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. For our God is a consuming fire." If you look at the entire Old Testament and the New Testament, the uniform account of Scripture from Moses when he met God in a burning bush, to Elijah when he met God in a rock, to Isaiah when he met God in the temple, and fast forward to the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, and to John in the book of Revelation, and a lot of others who had a face-to-face encounter with God. The uniform account here is a fearful presence of God, whether Old or New Testament. Therefore, this calls us to realize that the presence of God, the holiness of God, it is not something that we come to with familiarity. And so many Christians, like Moses, they come to the burning bush and they see the burning bush, but unlike Moses, they never take their sandals off. And therefore, we tend to talk about how amazing grace is, but there is nothing in us that tells us how amazing that grace is.